Good evening. I'm Chris Matthews. Welcome to a Hardball special report, the selling of a war and the attack on its critics. When I first heard the disclosures in Scott McClellan's new book, I thought of the scene in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, when that corrupt senior senator runs onto the Senate floor yelling, "Everything he says is true." For months and years now, Hardball told the two-part story of how the Iraq War was sold under the false pretense that Saddam Hussein posed a nuclear threat to the United States, and that people in the Bush administration sought to destroy those who unmasked the plotting. Here is Scott McClellan writing in What Happened about Bush's, quote, lack of candor and honesty in selling the Iraq War. Quote, what drove Bush toward military confrontation more than anything else was an ambitious and idealistic post-9/11 vision of transforming the Middle East through the spread of freedom. This view was grounded in a philosophy of, catch this phrase, coercive democracy, a belief that Iraq was ripe for conversion from a dictatorship into a beacon of liberty through the use of force, and a conviction that this could be achieved at nominal cost. McClellan said Bush and his neoconservative supporters in and out of the administration downplayed this motive and instead emphasized the threat of WMD and the possible link between Iraq and terrorism. Quote, the decision to downplay the democratic vision as a motive for war was basically a marketing choice. Bush and his advisors knew that the American people would almost certainly not support a war launched primarily for the ambitious purpose of transforming the Middle East. Quote, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Wolfowitz were evidently pursuing their own agendas. President Bush, however, bears ultimate responsibility for the invasion of Iraq. He made the decision to invade, and he signed off on a strategy for selling the war that was less than candid and honest. Having described how the Bush administration sold the Iraq war on a dishonest basis, that Iraq posed a nuclear threat to the U.S., Scott McClellan describes how the administration then acted to protect the dishonest argument. He tells how top White House officials, including Karl Rove and Scooter Libby, leaked the CIA role of Joe Wilson's wife, Valerie, then how both men denied their action to his face, that's Scott McClellan's face, allowing him to tell that lie to the press and the public. McClellan writes that the worst aspect of the whole story was the failure of the press to see through to the real horror of the Iraq War and the CIA leak case. So that's the real horror exposed by Scott McClellan in the new book today, that an American aversion to foreign entanglements passed down from George Washington himself was so easily and tragically overturned by George W. Bush. In a few minutes, we'll talk to former White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer, but we begin with NBC's David Gregory, who covers the Bush White House, in addition to hosting MSNBC's Road to the White House at 6 o'clock every night here, and the Politico's Mike Allen, who broke the McClellan book story. First, my colleague, David Gregory, thank you so much for being here this special night. What's the impact to you, who covered this story day to day, the build-up to war, the case made for war, that now one of the real inside political players is saying, the real motive for the war wasn't WMD. It wasn't the threat of a nuclear threat from Iraq. It was this motive, this deep mission to democratize the Middle East through coercive action.
Well, a couple of points. First of all, I think what is shocking about this is the source. Scott McClellan is somebody that we knew and covered and did not know that he held these kinds of strong views. It certainly was not within the context of his job to break ranks like this, and he didn't do it. He didn't do it with a wink and a nod. He didn't do it privately. He didn't do it publicly. This is the first time that a Bush insider, a loyalist from the days back in Texas, remember his brother worked for the administration too, Mark McClellan, has broken with this administration and so sharply criticized the president about the war, the driving policy of this administration, the driving policy that will make up the Bush legacy. That's significant, and it says that not everybody who was close to the president was on board with the direction that he was setting. But I think we need some context in all of this too, Chris, and that is Scott McClellan did not formulate war policy. He was an observer. He was up close, although in the run-up to the war, he was an assistant to Ari Fleischer, who will be on in a few moments. He was pretty far away from the action when it came to developing policy for the war. In some respects, this criticism is derivative of other critiques of the war offered by critics of the administration, whether they're conservative, Republican, Democrats and Republicans, or liberal. He's making judgments, which he's certainly entitled to make, But it's also worth pointing out that he was not upfront in formulating this war policy.
Let me go back to the question then of the revelation here. Here's a person who was in a professional but political capacity inside the White House, and all that experience led him to believe that the motivating force for the war was not a fear of a nuclear attack, as sold by the administration as the reason for the war, but an ideological imperative to democratize the Middle East by force. You don't believe that he had the exposure to the personnel at the top to have formed that on his own, that it was derivative from other sources outside the White House experience?
I'm just saying that it's consistent with criticism that we've seen outlined in other books by journalists or other criticism of the war since it has unfolded. I'm not diminishing that it's a real point of view and that it's his point of view as we understand it from this book. And again, to underscore the significance of that, that somebody who was in the business of making the argument for the war, whether he was an assistant to Ari Fleischer or later as press secretary, would believe that in fact propaganda was relied on to sell the war, that the president was out of touch, that he was believing his own spin, that this was in effect an attempt to reshape the Middle East under the guise of creating this sort of gathering threat.
Right.
But I just think for context,
but isn't the context here very parallel to that of someone inside the tobacco industry that points out that they were doctoring the cigarettes to make them more addictive? Isn't it the information, the fact that it comes from the inside, more potent?
Yes, I agree. I think there's no question about that. And I'm not making a different argument. I do think because it's from an insider, somebody who was part of this, it is important. The point I'm trying to make is that he was not an insider who was actually formulating policy. So one shouldn't get the idea that he was inside there sparring with those who were making the policy, saying, hey, this isn't right. We're relying on propaganda. We're doing the wrong thing here. He wasn't really engaged in that argument at the time. He's making judgments a little bit later on.
Let me go to Mike on the question of the cover-up, the whole question of how they dealt with attacking. The fact that this book on 3 different occasions said the Vice President of the United States was leading the charge in terms of discrediting Joe Wilson and his wife Valerie Wilson in the CIA in order to destroy their credibility. What do you make of that charge from the inside?
Right, Chris, and that's a classic example of why I have an alternative title for this book, which is Now They Tell Us. And Scott McClellan says in here that he was at best misled by both Karl Rove and the Vice President's Chief of Staff, Scooter Libby. Now, he largely leaves it to fill in what happened at worst, but he makes it clear that he knew, had in the back of his mind from the very beginning, that he was not getting the full story. He talks about how he chose his words carefully in an effort, unsuccessful, he admits, to protect himself and his credibility when out there. And he paints this picture of these very awkward meetings where he's still out there taking the bullets for them and defending them when it's becoming more clear day by day from the news coverage that what they told him was just not right. And, you know, David talks about the source of the information here being powerful. The other great power of this book is that it validates, as David said, these criticisms that have come from the liberal and left-wing bloggers, most especially his point that the White House press corps was too deferential to this administration. David and I have fought back about those charges over the years, largely because of the work of people like David Gregory. It just isn't true. But now the left can say, even Scott McClellan says you guys were too easy on the Bushies.
Well, let's go right now.
I mean, but you know,
go ahead, David.
I'm sorry if I can just say a couple points. I mean, this notion that somehow we were too easy on him or in the run-up to the war. I mean, it just doesn't jibe with the kinds of things he was saying at the time, or you know, it's the idea that he's was on a completely different plane during that whole time when you got no sense of it. I think that's a separate discussion, but I don't think that's a credible charge.